So that I think in the sort of political register would be about politicizing security, because I think what the security system seeks to do, I think,
That's exactly it. Yeah.
is to say these threats are just that. They take them at face value. These are obvious threats, and the kind of the critical response to that is that, well, no, they're not. I mean, these are constructed as threats. How dangerous is this, and what are the dangers of responding to it in the way that you're advocating and responding to it?
Like, as soon as you've got what we evolved with, you've got the eye-to-eye connection with everyone that's got any actual imposition over your life. I mean, this could be some sort of federated thing. There's obviously going to be some sort of other authority, but as soon as the vast majority of your needs and desires are managed and mitigated by the people who you've got a direct connection to, almost everything that's been a problem since agriculture just evaporates.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
So the book title is The Politics of Immunity, Security and the Policing of Bodies. And I've not read it, but I just think that I listened to him describe the sort of basic premise of it, and it's interesting because a personal stimulus for it was that he got an autoimmune disease. He's been studying security policy in a very critical way. He wrote a book that I've got called The Critique of Security, and the way in which, similar to how we've been discussing,
From a biopolitical sort of.
Already, but like the securitization, which is one of Agamben's points, and many others, but is a way of removing things from the democratic sphere into a sphere in which these things have become an existential threat, and therefore require the deployment of the security industry, which includes all the parts of the state which are focused on security and often have less oversight, and especially when you get into the kind of into the MI6 sort of MI5 space, and of course international security and the way in which it justifies wars and invasions, etc. So he'd got this autoimmune disease, and he was thinking about, just as an idea, I guess, what is the relationship between so our bodies do it, right? Our bodies, he said when he started reading the literature about that, because when you get an illness, you're like, obviously you want to sort of start learning about what's going on here, why has it happened, how do I understand this, maybe then you find sort of dietary or whatever things.
What are the inputs that I can put into the system?
And when he was reading it, he noticed that there was a lot of language, even in the academic literature, on immunity that was essentially political, and that was talking about defense mechanism,
Well, it is the ultimate metaphor for it. Isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. A metaphor. Yeah, exactly.
Social body versus physical body.
Yeah, social and political body versus a physical body, and in a way, the immune system is analogous to the different parts of the security system which are trying to protect the body politic from various different internal and external influences that could undermine or overthrow the status quo ante. And even listening to the Dark Horse guy about him describing how the immune system works, and I'm probably massively bastardizing it now, but I think either in neutral, as we're developing, what the body does is it has the sort of antibodies or the whatever aspects of the immune system that act in order to recognize different proteins or whatever it is they're recognizing. And what happens is there's a process of elimination whereby the body starts to recognize me versus not me, and it's through that recognition then that you then when you're born and you sort of develop, you've got an immune system that should, if it's operating well, be 100% accurate in terms of recognizing me from not me. But in fact, what tends to happen in all sorts of autoimmune diseases is that that's being disrupted or goes wrong in some way, and then it starts to attack itself.
It's interesting that like a fanatical adherence to the concept of sovereignty is like your core immune system, because it's the line. Do you know what I mean? You know, like if you
So-
for someone who has who centralizes the idea of sovereignty versus someone who doesn't. Someone else might say, well, sovereignty is not important, like a bit like you were talking about.
Individual sovereignty.
Individual sovereignty as a person, yeah. Like someone might, like you were talking about your John.
Yeah.
Would say no. It's more about the social contract. It's more about being for other people or whatever. More Marxist view. There's at that point. I mean, it gets more complicated because that immunity thing spreads out at that point, and maybe there's benefits at that network level or whatever. But it's funny. It just when you do. I was in analogy mode while you couldn't help doing the metaphor thing as you were going through different things, and it's funny how that core immune function that's being set in place at that point in utero. Its analogy in a political sense is sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty, because it's the line me and not me, you know.
Yeah.
Go on. Sorry.
So yeah, rather than I think he was wanting to kind of think about the way in which security discourse and apparatuses of security are almost in the
Who is the chap, by the way? What's his name?
He's called Mark Neocleus. Neo and then Cleos. Mark Neocleus. And yeah, so the way in which I think security in and of itself, you know, almost in the abstract, is by which I mean, I guess, you know, putting aside any kind of agendas or whatever, just the fact that, you know, in the same way as obviously your immune system doesn't have an agenda because it's, you know, it's a functional responsive mechanism or whatever that can become you know, can start non-functional or misfunction. Yeah, how something that's ostensibly designed to protect can start to actually cannibalize the system which it's purporting to protect, and
like
how
the
that
cytokine storm in COVID.
Yeah.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's I'm sure there's much more. I've not read the book, but I was just listening to him introduce it, and that's kind of, you know, Agamben says at one point that you know, he says something like the most advanced thoughts of security are in the end ultimately fatal to democracy. You know, you cannot have, and there's, you know, I was reading, you know, plenty of others in the critical security studies that say certain things because, you know, for all sorts of reasons, you know, they build in a kind of a notion of suspicion rather than of sort of, you know, commonality of citizenship. They're ultimately based on promoting fear and often inflating risks because, you know, again, not necessarily, although of course in many cases because of an agenda, but by the very nature of that lens that we're applying to our world. So if you live, you know, like Agamben was saying, if you live in a world in which, you know, to go back to the biopolitics thing, if you live in a world in which the protection of life understood predominantly in terms of bare life or a biopolitical life, as opposed to the life in the polis and the political life and the importance of citizenship and all sorts of other values that arise around that. You know, if the thing that binds us together is, like I said, you know, as long as Netflix is flowing and as long as, you know, we are, our lives are elongated as long as possible because we just live in a, you know, material world and that's the end of everything, and therefore, you know, why wouldn't we sort of valorize that? And because there's no political horizon beyond, you know, the sort of status quo, and we live in the best system possible, and even though many people are unhappy in it, it's like, well, otherwise it's kind of Stalinism or Maoism or Nazism or whatever, you know, be glad of what you've got. So you live in that kind of fixed temporal horizon, you know, like whoever it was that said, you know, people can more easily imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So within that, yeah, a security kind of lens and apparatus that's applied to sort of manage this kind of status quo. You know, it's like stability. We need stability and we need security, and you know, I just thought it was quite interesting because you don't have to, although you obviously could do empirically, look at okay, well, once that institution's set up, then from a kind of almost, rational actor perspective applied to the institution, it's going to want to, at the very least, maintain itself and justify itself. And, you can give NATO as an example after the end of the Cold War. Well, surely it would just disband. Its function is no longer served. No, there's a new set of threats. There's a new set of whatever. You could give, the example of, all the rhetoric around 9/11, which was about like producing a threat landscape, and therefore you could do that, and then you could just look at it in the abstract, with this analogy to immune system, and see that when that becomes dominant, if we want to defend sort of democracy, it might actually have to be sort of against security, and it's obvious because of Hobbes, like going back to, if the only thing that binds us is mutual fear and the need for security, and that's the basis of the social contract, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting direction to go in. This isn't necessarily continuing that or taking it anywhere, but I think it's a good relevant distinction. Like when I said that thing before about the limits of the analogy, right? So the analogy of that social body and body kind of thing, right? It leaves out, when I said that about the sovereignty thing, as an example, it leaves out the fact that in a biological sense, the two spheres of conscious abstract thinking political man versus monkey man, advanced monkey man. Advanced monkey man, it holds perfect.
Sounds like a superhero character, that cartoon superhero.
Mr. Advanced Monkey Man, it holds because it is a case of me, not me. Especially in terms, I suppose, going back to, I suppose as soon as you've got a tribe, as soon as you've got networked Homo sapiens, then it becomes what we're talking about, what we are. But the limitation on it is, it was too simplistic when I was saying, drawing that analogy of sovereignty and that immune function, because humans at our level get so far with the barrier up, but then once the barrier comes down and risk comes at the gain of networking, we become more than what we were. This is the whole the social sort of the social factor, right? So then you start that journey of a decrease, a cost of sovereignty for networked capacity, because the ultimate sovereignty is just, I'm going to go and run up to the top of the mountain, I'm going to feed myself on my own, I'm not going to have, I'm going to a simple animal existence without any risk or chance of growth and advancement and evolution, versus the sort of openness of like expanding out into broader spheres through social systems and whatever else. And that's exactly what we do. It's it's undeniable that there might be some root behind it, but it's undeniable that that's one of the visible key components of humanity, right? And the more we do that, the networked benefits that come as a result immediately start out, I would say, as a comparable benefits. It gets into individuals and collectivism, obviously. It starts out as being, I am opening out as an individual into this sphere for individual gain and familial gain and tribal gain or whatever. And then there has to be, it's inescapable that within systems where processes can emerge within that system, like an elite, to use the obvious example, where the system, it's not just an organic system now, arguably. There are structures that materialize within that system that can turn the system to work for them specifically as groups of individuals, right? And at that point, I think that's when you get into this security thing. To make it simpler, that individual aspect of consciousness, biological entity, whatever you want, opens up, gets an immediate gain itself, and that gain ascends to a certain point at which there may be structures within the system that are acting against it, or a negative, a counterbalancing thing against its own benefit. and B, the security gains, the security gains that come from openness, start to. There's a tipping point when you have to close off again. Like, you've opened out into that networked reality, and there are immediate and tangible gains, and you can see them in history. But then there's a point at which you don't need to go like this, but there's a point at which you need to temper that position. And I'd argue that's sort of close to what you're talking about with this. There's a point at which the security is under. It's not a one directional thing I'm saying, but I'm just that there seems to me to be a connection between that idea that what helps you and makes you move forward at a certain point can become the very thing that is the biggest threat to you.
Yeah, and I guess, going to that Gambon quote that you did send me, which is something to the effect of, a certain point from seeing like a state, everyone looks like a terrorist. Well,
yeah, and he says, and probably rightly so. He puts
right.
in there as well, probably rightly so.
In what sense do you think?
In the sense that any right-thinking civilian should be eyeing authority with disdain, and like.
Right, okay.
Well, even he probably shouldn't put words in his mouth. I'd say what he's definitely saying is probably rightly so, in the sense that the greatest threat to the state comes from groups of civilians.
But then looking at it from the civilian population again, and what the actual, what the proper functioning of security should be. That's clearly not good now. And then just moving back to the bodily.
What's metaphor, clearly not good?
Well, that everyone's seen as a potential terrorist, and we'll have to unpack that, because I think that's obviously quite a bold statement that people would be like, oh, that's not really the case, is it? But just quickly linking back to the immunity metaphor. Well, I mean, that is surely the definition of autoimmune disease, right? If the body politic is made up, or the social body is made up of this, fundamentally the citizens, and then I guess various different social structures and institutions and technical structures and everything else, but like fundamentally it's in the service of human beings, and everyone appears like a potential enemy, then. It's not at this point literally attacking those, and therefore essentially cancerous, in a biological sense, but it's presumably a defunct immune system that's been unable to do that original thing, which is. And
what's the thing that's really interesting there is, why does that happen? Like, it's the analogy. This is a couple of ways of expanding the analogy out for that bear fruit. I think when someone gets cancer, or if there's an inflammatory response, the immune system is not doing what it's supposed to do. It's because the inputs aren't right, the nutrition isn't right, or the stress is too high, or whatever. Right. So there's that. But the other thing is, another way I think the analogy works really good is. And it sounds like I'm.
Yeah, maybe it's the media that's that's doing the stressing and the. And
the other one is that the sometimes not to bring it back. I'm trying, and I know I can't help doing it, but I'm bringing in that third factor. It's not just the individual and the collective; it's the individual, the collective, and information asymmetries within the collective that allow certain groups of individuals to try and gain more power, which is just the political reality of mankind, right? And the way that analogy, you can analogize that back, is sometimes the body, the physical body, becomes inflamed. There's an input from outside, and the immune system responds. But then sometimes there's parasites in nature, actual parasites that exist, to trigger an COVID's a good example. Cytokine storm is a good example of it. I'm not sure if the virus is in. I can't remember. I'm not sure what the mechanism is. So probably shouldn't use that as an example. But there are definitely cases.
Use a safer one
then. There are examples in nature of a parasitic biological another organism penetrating into our bodily integrity and triggering a state of affairs in which our immune system fights itself in order to undermine the system. And that's a really good analogy for the want of a better term, an elite or an apex authority or the tyrant, whatever it is doing, because it's not necessarily it's not necessarily that there's a landscape out. It would have been in nature. There's a landscape out there of threats, and I've got this physical body, and I bump up against it, and sometimes these immunological reactions take place. There is also, both at the bodily level and in the political reality of us now, outside the metaphor, where a parasitic factor can manipulate that situation in order to create something that will undermine that immunological.
And so that I think in the sort of political register would be about, you know, politicizing security, because I think you know what the security system seeks to do, I think,
that's exactly it,
is to say these threats are just that, you know, you know, take them at face value. These are obvious threats, and the kind of, you know, the critical response to that is that, well, no, they're not. I mean, these are constructed as threats. You know, how dangerous is this, and what are the dangers of responding to it in the way that you're advocating of responding to it, i.e., usually moving things into a sphere of government, if you like, or a state response, or of state corporate response that remove this from the ability for citizens to partake and sort of guide the trajectory of the shared reality that they're operating in. So actually we're going to politicise the fact that, you know, terrorism is the greatest sort of threat to the Western world, because is it not potentially exactly what you're saying, the parasite that's kind of creating an exaggerated threat in order to kind of, you know, with the consequences of creating all sorts of chaos within the body politic and so on. So yeah, that's pretty good.
You get straight back to all the Agamben stuff. You know, this sort of and just all the worst moments from history. You know, the infection, the disease correlation. You know, between the you know, whoever the tyrant's given unwashed group of people are, that it wants to sideline and make the exception. The correlation with a viral component of the infection.
So there was, because I got sent something that's really relevant to this, because what I was going to go on to the kind of biopolitical tattooing thing.
What?
What's
that?
Well, it's, I mean, so Agamben refused to go and do his lectures in the US at one point. At the point at which I think they wanted to take fingerprints of anyone that was coming in on a visa. You know, and it's that thing that we've just discussed before, that, you know, he saw that as a line, and this is about sort of inscribing these bodily elements, like whether it's your genetic code or whether it's your fingerprints and so on, that firstly were originally, certainly in terms of fingerprints, designed for criminals. Like, you know, it's the same with tagging that's like, you know, involved in the track and trace. All these technologies that are originally designed for, if you like,
the threat.
The threat of the, you know, that the immune system
the body politic
needs to do, becomes something that everyone then has to take on in the interests of security and protection and so on. But and you know, people's concern, including Agamben's and but many others, was that one of the things that COVID's done under the biopolitics is to sort of massively expand and normalise and provide a rationale for
other than a bit of a nice wealth redistribution.
So this is just a current affairs kind of example of that. So this is an article. Dover port boss warns of safety issues and delays with new EU ferry passengers. So ferry passengers will need to get out of their cars for the capturing of biometric data, which has to be done at the point of departure and is due to start this autumn.
Why is this happening more now?
So the EES will record people's name, type of travel document, biometric data, fingerprints and facial images, date and place of entry and exit at the border, automatically calculating the amount of time they are permitted to stay in the Schengen area.
So what's the justification for that?
It'll well, I mean, I don't know what the kind of, I mean, it's probably something that they've wanted for a long time, and it's about securing borders, isn't it? It's securing borders and managing the flow of people. Yeah, but what's their ostensible?
Like, what are they saying?
Well, that'll be it. I mean, they're happy to say that, aren't they?
And now the only reason they're getting away with it is because COVID's kind of readied people for it, softened them up.
Potentially, yeah, arguably, but I mean, maybe it'd have come otherwise. Yeah, so it says, Port of Dover has reiterated warnings that there could be major delays when the EU's entry-exit system, EES, comes into force this autumn, as it is still lacking practical solutions for the infrastructure and processes to cope with the changes. So, I mean, they're just coming from the point of view, this is going to slow down business and so on. But obviously from the point of the citizen, you know, again, like it's similar to, you know, Gambon raises the point, you know, that the polis, you know, if you think, you know, the citizenship comes from, you know, etymologically and kind of politico-ontologically from the city. You know, it's the citizen within the city. You know, these autonomous governing regions that is who's kind of, it's got nothing to do with the animality of the person, you know, their fingerprints or their genetic code or anything else. It's to do with what that person is as a citizen in a polis, and their rights and their you know, their political volition to engage in the process of you know, I guess in Aristotle's terms, of kind of defining the good life in collaboration with other citizens in order to make sort of political decisions. You know, what is the kind of weird hybrid thing in a city where you are constantly surveilled, like take London, more so than any other city as far as I'm aware, including I guess China, by more security cameras. That's a kind of merging of of prison and city. So yeah, it's not a prison per se, but it's, you know, the sorts of technologies and the sorts of governing rationalities and the sorts of, you know, panoptic but you know, the function of the panopticon and so on is being implanted into the city. Now people accept that, and of course you could mount, you know, a huge amount of reasons for why that should be the case. But you know, it's recognising across the board that these things are happening, and that they're being constantly amplified, and they're being amplified now down to the level of, yeah, you know, biometrically scanning people's faces, and that's, you know, that's got nothing to do with who they are as citizens. It's got nothing to do. It's I mean, and it's like, well, again, it's population management. It's like you would do to cattle, right? It's like, you know, it's barcoding. It's using the biological features of you in order to catalogue you, mark you, monitor you,
but it's like process that thing again. It's like that thing where you can argue,
like you can only do this in order to have your freedoms. Otherwise, you know, you don't have the rights of a citizen. You don't have the.
But it's like that classic quote of. Well, I suppose it's got some correlation to this, but there's two ways of looking at it. The quote of there are no. It relates to there are no political solutions. There are only technological solutions, and that everything comes back to the movement forward of technology. And I'd argue parallel to that. I can't look at history and see anything other than a journey of authoritarian will as expressed through technology. As soon as the technology existed by which people could be brought to heel under it with a decent amount of equilibrium, you know, like if it was balanced between the mob and the elite, whatever you want to say, if imposing force through this technology, if they could just do the same thing back, then it didn't happen. Like there's been, for 20 years, we've been in a situation where some of these technologies could have been applied and have been tried to be applied. You got like ID cards with Blair 20 years ago, right?
And you've got like Assange, you know, I know it's slightly different, but you've got like, you know, the WikiLeaks that kind of took the tool of peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, and you got the file sharing, you know, yeah.
But as soon as you're at a level of an advancement of the technology, combined always with a monopoly on power, obviously, at the end of the day, this is my argument with Bitcoin. As someone who knows next to nothing about Bitcoin, at least relative to people who do know a bit about it, what by that I mean I probably know more than most people in my environment while knowing jack shit compared to the people who are really into it. But my argument's always been that you can dress the blockchain stuff up in as many fancy clothes as you want. If someone's got a monopoly on violence, all they have to do is ban any, in the same way war on drugs style, ban any access to that technology. You're going to jail if we even see you mining 1 Bitcoin kind of thing, right? So I can't get excited about the whole Bitcoin thing when it all comes back to the monopoly on force, which still exists in the hands of the state.
I guess, yeah.
Go on.
There's an economy of power, isn't there, in a way that, when these, it's like with file sharing, it would just, especially when people are using VPNs and all the rest of it, it would just be impossible for them to, or the amount of energy that would need to be expended. So I guess there are kind of technological things.
It's not just like war on drugs. It's like someone can grow drugs in their house, and we've still spent years with all those people thrown in jail. Do you know what I mean? You can. There's no hiding, especially against technology. It comes back to technology. You can't, and regulating power supply, right? So if you've, energy supply. So we're going to be at a point through smart meters now where, to use the drug manufacturer thing as an example, where as soon as someone's using a light to grow some cannabis, as an example, they'll be able to tell you the actual model and year of manufacture of the bulb that you're using through a power signature that's coming through, right? To use that as one example, same thing with mining Bitcoin or something. So as soon as someone can send the goons to the door and drag you into the van and go and throw you in jail for 15 years, you won't need long of that happening before people say, okay, Bitcoin's finished. You got a government version of it? Yeah, we'll take it. So, I mean, that's obviously a whole other conversation, but that's kind of my default go-to on it. And I've not heard a really solid argument to totally disregard it yet. But the technology thing, as soon as the capacity exists, and this sounds very kind of, it takes a lot of the agency and the beautiful poetic story of mankind's, kind of evolution of, liberty and political structures and Magna Carta and anything else. It's like the history is people pushing, and you're getting potentially something like what someone might present the Magna Carta as, or whatever. You get the pushback in different groups. You do get that. But it's all almost meaningless next to the advancement of technology, at which point whoever has the monopoly on power will use that technology in order to impose more control. And part of that arrangement isn't just, can I hit you with this stick without you hitting me back with an equivalent thing. Part of it is actually having some of that new technological advancement, but holding it back for the optimal time when it can be imposed in a way that it is just game, set and match. Like, it's checkmate. Like, you can't... What they're doing now... And I think this is sort of playing out with how many spheres of chaos there are between COVID, Russia, all the social justice stuff. There's just so much chaos wherever you look. You could devote your life to one of those spheres, and there's 5 interacting constantly. When you look at that, it sounds a bit doom and gloom, but like there's not a lot of response. It's like the moment at which this sort of stuff's being put in place. The whole ID card thing and everything. There is maybe this won't age well. And I'm not saying this time next year. I'm not even saying 5 years from now. But I'm saying an unmovable progress forward. That maybe it'll be 25 years, but it seems insane to look at the amount of effort that's being put in, combined with the technological capacities that exist and are emerging. It's insane to me. Well, I'll say this, I'll nail a call to the mast on this. It would be the first time in human history that something like that could exist, that could regulate people in that way, and it doesn't get imposed, And I feel like that's where we're at now, is just the fact that the technology's there. So of course they're going to do it, and they always have. I think it's... Yeah, it's quite. It's an open. I'm not saying it's a fact, but I am persuaded that that's the way it's always been.
Yeah, and so there's it's probably worth kind of mentioning I think there's the technology that is evolving as a result of predominantly capitalist enterprise, and there's the control that comes with that, because I did quite a lot of reading around free software, And the point was, I love the Stallman quote. It's free as in speech, not as in beer. I'm like, it's like I'm not bothered whether it costs anything. That's not the point. It so happens that when you do it in this way, it has to not cost something as well. But that's not the point. It's about how is this technology being built? How transparent is it? Do essentially the workers, or the people making the software and the people,
is it a community resource?
Yeah, and the people interacting with it, can they see what it's doing, and are they in control of what they want it to do? So now, of course, with kind of surveillance capitalism and all the rest of it, there's the like, you don't, there's no free meal. When you're getting free apps, when you're getting, free services like search engines, etc., it's because it's gaining value from extracting data from you, and talk about, the kind of panopticon with that stuff. I mean, it's creating, its aim is control, because control, to sort of broaden out the meaning of the word, if you don't have control, you don't have profit. Like if you didn't control, this space. So similarly, if there's not people controlling your data, if there's not people kind of placing property rights on that as the content that they're extracting and then selling it into futures markets or selling it to advertisers or whatever. So there's this kind of control grid that is being developed, sort of, and the same will apply to biotech. To the kind of, will it be, because there's the potential for all of these things to be liberatory and to be used in positive ways. Again, if there was some kind of either personal sovereign control and or kind of genuinely sort of decentralized democratic control as to how we will develop and adopt these technologies, and when we'll say no thank you and when we'll say yes, and so on. And I'm not a complete sort of Luddite or technophobe, but it's, on the one hand, you've got that weight of power, which is the capitalist system, and the way in which it has, it is all about it taking control, and then controlling you in order to, whether it's as banal, sort of banal as selling your products, or whether it's more sinister in terms of creating backdoors so security services can monitor what you're doing, etc. And then there's the reason of state, if you like, which is more for that type of quote about we're responsible for the flow of people and populations, and maintaining the borders and all sorts of other responsibilities, like, let's say, sort of public health or whatever, and the use of technologies to be able to control populations in the same way as you would, I shouldn't say the same way, but in certainly increasingly analogous ways to which you would want to control cattle on a farm in order to make sure that you're maximising the economic output of that, you're minimising the costs of the space, you're regulating, etc., their food intake and their biometric qualities, so that you're getting maximum yield from them and all the rest of it, and they're all about control. So in those contexts, when those, if you like, when that kind of, I mean, you can distinguish the two, when the kind of the reason of state, or the sort of state ideology, if you like, is geared towards that, a biopolitical sort of rationality, and when the capitalist economy is geared towards what it is geared to do with these technologies, then you're just going to get more and more kind of oppressive control systems vis-a-vis the sovereign individual.
And you've got the
but sorry, one other thing, just to kind of because, like you were saying, it's fairly pessimistic and so on, and I think it kind of
well, especially in the sense, hold it, because you can respond to both at the same time. Especially in the sense, the pessimism is the technological point I making about technology before, combined with the other great tool in the arsenal of the hypothetical entrenched elite, which is the boiling frog. Just the fact that we're more used to now what we wouldn't have accepted a year ago or whatever. So it's not even just the wait for the technology and roll it out. It's the the rate at which the technology is advancing is appropriate. We wouldn't want it right now because we also want people to be more conditioned to the situation. One quick example of that, it's two years since people were losing their mind over the fact that they were picking the phone up and being advertised for something they'd just been talking about. Like a threshold. It's like, no, this is insane. It's just a few years since people were disgusted at the idea that you would share someone's email, that you put your email into something and now you're getting all these adverts back. And that would be something that would be seen as being at the very, understandable while also bullshit, basically. Now I get emails as a business owner saying, are you collecting your email addresses from your customers? You really need to start collecting. And it's like it's a thing where it's like they don't expect, there's no part of them that's expecting me to go, fuck off. Like no, I'm not actually. I'm not trying to collect people's emails against their, without them presenting them to me. That cultural shift has happened now. And that we just within a couple of years, those things keep getting knocked down. So I think, there's the technological advancement, then there's the boiling frog thing. Those two things combined, that's the sort of pessimistic sort of thing together.
And so I guess the question is, will there be a point? And I mean, there obviously are already. It comes back to that Paul Northwood sort of thing about, at what point do you say
Paul Kingsnorth.
Pretty
sure we name drop him every single episode.
At what point are we at what point do people just say no, and he's kind of limit the technology to the ones that the cost benefit analysis is kind of most in service to them, and kind of go and get a farmhouse or whatever. And then of course you're like, okay, well, let's build more community around that. And so I guess you get to the point of a kind of counter economics, which is undoubtedly going to have to be, would be more localized, and people choose to renunciate the purported benefits of a more complex kind of economy with the different gadgets and even real benefits potentially in certain medical situations or whatever,
and benefits
to a more kind of even illich conviviality of what does it actually mean to live? What does it mean to have more kind of agency and control over the tools that you use? What we were saying before around the scale of the networks and whether you can go to the farm and look at the thing, and it's whether there will be maybe I kind of think more and more, and it chimes with the Kevin Carson stuff as well. More and more that seems like the only exit, like that's and to the extent
some degree of that,
or
even just to start with, openness to the possibility, because at the moment the ascent of man, that's not the right term for it, but the ascendancy of mankind in terms of keep getting bigger, don't slow the economy, go to space, it's all about growth. It would be a paradigm shift just for 50% of the population to be open to the possibility that it's not necessarily about getting bigger, advancing everything. There may be limits that it may be that the most optimal future for mankind, individually and collectively, would be to shackle growth and technology.
Well, I think for the reasons you were sort of mentioning before around, we've evolved in this state for whatever it is, 200 million years.
Yeah, 2 million years without any change whatsoever, basically.
Yeah,
and then 12,000 years ago or thereabouts, being taken out of our goldfish bowl. Well, no, being taken out of the sea and dropped in a goldfish bowl.
Yeah. So you could, I'm sure you can make those types of arguments to say, well, just irrespective of where we're heading, like that is a more, rewarding and kind of, environment
for the individual and for small groups, not for the collective. It's
but
arguable that the human race keeps building in a skyscraper sense far quicker at the expense of the individual and keeping us in this outer normal arrangement.
But I think, I guess, so there's certain people that will exit for kind of, let's just, for want of a better word, call it ideological reasons. Their analysis of the world, and maybe they're just their knowledge, like
the
you said,
hippie position,
of what makes them feel
fulfilled.
And so that the kind of exit for that reason. I think that would become more of a population wide or significant proportion of the population when actually this, and again this is the Kevin Carson point, is the system's in such a kind of such a decline that actually, like if you take the fuel crisis now, people feel that primitive threat. It's like all of a sudden, like, you know, what I thought I had, and the kind of management of my household, and the kind of, you know, support, you know, supporting my family, and the kind of, you know, the core elements of my lifestyle that are the kind of bedrock, not necessarily all the frivolous additions. That's kind of under threat. This system,
which in history the analogy would be literally getting up one morning, opening your tent, and the animals that sustain your tribe have all gone. Like it's
or
life,
at least
and,
have half died because of sun.
I suppose so. Yeah,
with the energy.
There's a tangible direction that's saying the point I'm making is it's an almost total, if not a total threat. It's not this slow shift. It's to the degree that's shocking, and that your rational response would be, "We're screwed. We need another alternative." And that level of panic in our society, there's so many ways it's happening as well. Obviously, in all different terms, different ways that collapse. You know, in terms of financial collapse and unsustainable growth and all the rest of it.
And even though I happen to think that the weight of evidence, and maybe it's just my kind of paranoia or whatever. You know, if we take the COVID thing, that it probably was a lab leak, and therefore that has all sorts of other implications about actually, you know, in a sense, it's man-made, and it's man's. It is the whole sort of complex around that techno-scientific with the economic stuff in there that is driving the agenda to do those types of experiments.
Well, then, and you're forced as well. You have to at that point as well say there's two reasons there'd be a lab leak, given the amount of wealth dispersal and change that there's been as a result of it. COVID has screwed over one group of people and hugely benefited another group of people, especially authority and state power, right? Not calling the conspiracy that it was leaked purposefully in order to expand state interests, but it's not impossible. Like, and you, as soon as you recognise there was a lab leak, you've got to also be open to and consider the reasons why there was a lab leak. It might not just be that it was, you know.
And just as a tiny bit of evidence that, I mean, again, it doesn't mean that it was purposely leaked, but no one, I mean, obviously certain areas of the online space talk about it, but it's like the fact that some of our tabloids were carrying the pictures of those Chinese people falling flat on the thing, the fact that that's gone down the memory hole, that like no respectable things like pulled that out and gone, wait a minute, wait, what's that about, right? Hello everyone, what was that about? You know, even if it's to debunk it, I mean, they might say that, this was some kind of, these videos are fake or whatever, or they came from whatever it is, but it's like, the fact that it's like, you're not doing that, but, so what, you know, however it leaked, you can see that is an immediate signal that there was an interest to spread fear worldwide on the back of it. But anyway, where I was going with that is, you know, if you take the dominant narrative around it, that, you know, the wet market leak, and so even in the dominant space, they're saying it's possible that it was a lab leak now.
Yeah, I think the dominant, if not the dominant, it's a comparably dominant position that it leaks.
Well, let's say the official, you know, if you were to ask Tony Fauci, for example,
but
he's saying,
anyone but him.
but I think, you know, the establishment, let's say the establishment position rather than the dominant one, is that it was more likely the wet market, but we will entertain, you know, we can't discount the idea that it was lab.
But that important variable, like, but the reason that it would still be taken as the dominant isn't because of evidence. It's because it suits the status quo to not say something as crazy as China did this or whatever.
But where I'm going with this is, like, if it is, but the thing is, it could have been a wet market. These things happen. Yeah. There's more, what do they call it, where basically, you know, animal, human transmission. And the original kind of hypothesis from the majority of people was that it was that, and probably for good reason, because that is happening a lot. Is it zoonotic leap or whatever? but the reason for that is varied, but it includes the massive increase in kind of global flows of people and commodities. It includes sort of the increased, I don't know the full details, but basically kind of ecological destruction that's going on is contributing to it. Probably sort of interactions between, they know from like hunting monkeys and all these kind of things that are happening. So again, these are things that are happening because of the kind of that complexification of the system and these interconnections that at first appear to provide gains to the system, but then create all these kind of unintended consequences that are increasing the risk environment. So, from COVID to the more just general fact of, okay, there probably is going to be more disease prevalence now, and there's probably is going to be more viruses. And, we know that, different bodies are are developing plans on how to respond to this new threat environment. The increasing sort of tendencies for wars to happen, like the Ukraine example, like all of these things are reasons why people would be like, what's actually going to protect me and my family is providing a buffer at the very least, if not a sort of big firewall between what's going on in that outside world and the ability of me to feed my family and to get the basic, other social inputs that I need. Now, obviously, in the kind of, in a sort of Mad Max dystopia, if it all just kind of collapses, then, it's just going to get marauded. We are going to be in the kind of Hobbesian sort of scenario. But there's a big kind of... there's a lot of margin between that and that happening. And so people's, even language around resilience and stuff, it's like, okay, what's going to make me most protected from shocks, most protected from, emerging crises or whatever. It is going to be that kind of relocalization, kind of...
But that relocalization, like I think I said last time we talked, like, I floated the idea that, probably just to try and throw some optimism in, floated the idea that a political order, even a global political order with total hegemony, might benefit from having basically our worst nightmare of the dystopia in 2/3 of the planet, but then there being a space or pockets within the space for people to do this more individualist, more sort of
I don't think it's individualist.
I mean individualist as in what I mean by individualist is further down the scale away from collectivism. So if you've got a unified global order in the dystopia where we would imagine it, then it's unquestionably more individualist for people to be extricated out of that system that's completely collectivist.
I don't like the language because I actually think the other one would arguably be more collectivist. And again, it's the Kevin Carson argument.
One? Well, it depends.
We live in a society that is highly individualized.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying.
And the reason people stay in it is almost because of kind of the way in which it's.
So it's the definition.
Whereas the other one would be more of a solidarity. There probably would be, like Carson said, because he said he used to call himself a free market anarchist, and then he calls himself an anarchist with no prefix or whatever suffix. And then actually, his view is that left to its own devices, you would actually have a much more kind of mixed setup where you would have kind of Ostrom-style commons, you would have different forms of solidarity economies, different barter, sort of some areas of barter, and then some kind of, and also some market exchange, especially when you were like maybe reaching beyond the kind of immediate into sort of, these potential... relocalized counter economies with other ones that are more geographically dispersed or that have different kind of value regimes underpinning them or whatever, they're probably more market exchange and so on. So in a way, it would argue, I understand what you're saying.
There's a simpler answer. There's calling the localized collective in that situation individualist or calling it collectivist or individualist depends on the definition of collectivist, and if it's that vertical versus horizontal collectivism again. The dystopic global order is a horizontal collectivism
it's a
vertical collectivism at that point. The more communitarian sense of a collective is the horizontal collectivism, and they're as opposed to each other. In fact, they're more opposed to each other than individualism and collectivism are, because you can have individualism which is good for the people, and you can have collectivism which is good for the people, and you can have it in the other direction. So those, if we sort of mentioned that you could have it's possible, and maybe I'm sort of cynical about it, but I've got to keep open to it for the sake of my soul, that it might be that the established order levels out at a point in a way where free will kind of thing. If you want to be a moron and just consume junk, and you just want to go in the direction that humanity is going in, then there's one park for you. And if actually you want to be, empowered and self-sufficient, and you want to be a part of a tribe, and you want to be a modernized version of everything we had before and everything we've got now. I mean, this is actually probably what a really benevolent dictator would do, because you shouldn't be necessarily forcing people either way. Like there's an argument that those are two directions mankind can take, and people should have the choice. Because there's a lot of calm in that other one. Like in the mind control, just feeding junk food into me. It's not
a lot of anxiety though, isn't there?
There's definitely. Oh, don't get me wrong. I don't want it. I don't want it for a second. But I just mean there's a dulled, drugged state to it that is like, if I just don't even want the responsibility. I mean, I would argue every human being on planet Earth
getting like thing, and then you're like, oh.
Yeah, but there's definitely an almost suicide level. I just want to check out of it and just have people telling me how to feel all the time. My more cynical counter to that possibility.
Yeah.
And it triggered me. It was something you said that reminded me. It triggered me to say it. Is for the order to be maintained, unless the dystopia, the hypothetical future dystopia, unless it's literally, you're talking a level of reducing people's IQ to 15, kind of, unless it's literally a moronic kind of animalistic zombie culture, you couldn't really have that other order exist, because no one's you just kind of indirectly reference this, like everyone knows now, and they can see it now. They can see people, the fuel price goes up, they're looking around, and suddenly that lunatic friend they've got who was buying land 5 years ago or trying to get self-sufficient, he doesn't seem quite as crazy. Like there's if you're busy with a career that's making you advance within this system, the person who's learning to farm looks like they're going backwards. It looks ridiculous, and it would if they were going all the way back. But all it takes is for the dominant system's narratives to start collapsing, and its effect and its capacity to sustain people. The degree to which it collapses, the degree to which people just one step further back than you in that chain look smart, and the ones further look really smart, all the way back to a point where it starts going in the other direction. But these people here look very favourable, and that is it is now a bit of a cultural phenomenon, and it's gonna, unless the media space gets totally locked down, it's going to become a massive phenomenon, because there's no bigger game in town. What is going to, given we see what all the negatives are that are going to be not imposed on people, but just the negatives, whatever the agencies behind the system that we've got now, it's operating, every negative in it, every single one, is responded to perfectly by that going in that direction slightly, right? So this is going to be a movement on a scale of a religion. Like, it's just got something on the order that is going to happen unless it's totally locked down. So to counter what I was saying about the hypothetical nice potential for that zeitgeist to kind of utopia, it couldn't be allowed, because it's a counter narrative that totally undermines the control-based narrative that's required for that kind of
let's go back to the security thing as well, right? Because what does it take, to let's just call it the sort of status quo ante that's going further and further in that direction, as zoonotic disease and climate catastrophe and ecological breakdown and all these kind of things that it's essentially showing the hidden costs of a system that has been essentially in various different ways, whether through robbing the fertility of the land or building up potential sort of catastrophic events because of its kind of interconnectedness and because of its interdependencies, including, like I say, I think wars now, because look, as soon as there's, it's like we were talking about before, the West is trying to deprive Russia and Russian people of all the kind of systems of payment that are based on Western companies and various other kind of technological systems, and then vice versa. There's kind of issues around fuel, and so you get to see that actually these interconnections in a just-in-time sort of economy as well are all just points of fragility. They're all just points that if that snaps, we are screwed. So in that context, the security does become, it has to kind of, then it's like, right, how do we stop this real, piece of fragility here from breaking? How do we try to kind of techno-scientifically manage the increased potential of zoonotic diseases that can spread in seconds around the whole of the globe? How do we,
But there is no response to any of that, is there? The only response is to go backwards. Well,
I'm saying, yeah, but what's the system response? The system response is to just grow the architecture of security.
Yeah.
Because
until a tipping point.
Yeah, presumably.
Either collapse or it basically has to go to a point where it collapses.
Yeah.
Yeah, it collapses. It ends in a state of total control, like the ridiculous dystopia.
Yeah.
Or people move in the other direction, and for the people to move in the other direction, it's just totally inconceivable without some religious level movement that's kind of this unifying.
Yeah. And what is the I'll come back to that. But what is the sort of model of security for the other setting, right? Firstly,
which other setting?
Well, for the counter economy, localized kind of, trying to
almost doesn't
reorder.
Need a model.
No, exactly. I mean, you would want, I mean, I don't want to sort of list. Yeah, you would want like kind of, maybe some degree of neighborhood watch kind of thing. Probably, But
as soon as everyone's almost related and are mutually codependent, like as soon as you've got what we evolved with, you've got the eye-to-eye connection with everyone that's got any actual imposition over your life. I mean, this could be some sort of federated thing. There's obviously going to be some sort of other authority, but as soon as the vast majority of your needs and desires are managed and mitigated by the people who you've got a direct connection to, almost everything that's been a problem since agriculture just evaporates.
And this is like, I mean, there's loads of sources. I'm not saying that one has kind of captured all of it, but if you take the Ostrom stuff on the Commons, Eleanor Ostrom, like Nobel Prize winning economist. I mean, basically, we have talked about this a long time ago, but basically, she was the first person to really demolish a guy called Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons hypothesis. And because Garrett Hardin was taking essentially a kind of game theoretic abstract view, basically saying, well, everyone's a rational actor.
It's funny now. Game theory works brilliantly at this level. Like, but as soon as you get back to people who have got actually more of a desire to assist the person across them than they do to assist themselves. Yeah, and I think that's true. I think because they've got the pragmatic reason to do it, and then they've got the empathy that we all see when we look at people we really care about. That shit just evaporates.
Yeah, and it wasn't in a way that because Ostrom used certain bits of game theory as well, but but definitely your point's right, broadly speaking. But it was like, it's also a kind of a big tick in favour of empiricism, right? She was like, okay, you've sat back in your in your office in whatever university you work in, and used all these equations within game theory as to why there would be the tragedy of the common, and it's either the state or the market and blah. She's like, let's go and study really existing commons and let's try and work out what's going on. And in some cases they do lead to tragedy, and there's reasons why, and we can identify what weaknesses or kind of they have. And in many cases they don't, and because they've developed local institutional mechanisms. So there does have to be some degree of punishment if someone breaks that. There does need to be some degree of visibility or monitoring, if you like, so that things can't happen in secret, where then people are kind of lured towards being the forgot the word in game theory, but doing the individualistic thing that would bring immediate
the
benefit.
The rational.
The rational self-interest.
Yeah.
That would bring immediate benefit, but would ultimately screw up the system.
Yeah.
And then what you find is, aside from those kind of rational choice systems, what happens over time is that then norms kind of embed those things, and it becomes, it's almost outside of people's consciousness. They're just operating in the kind of normative sort of, not rule-based in necessarily formal rules, but the kind of rules that are, governing their behaviour as to how they do all those things.
Yeah.
But one other thing, she talked about polycentric systems because, it sort of comes back to the James C. Scott thing, seeing like a state, and like you were saying, isn't it interesting how when you at this level the game theory works, but at this level it's actually a very different picture. So, the polycentric systems are about, the fact that, you do need these nested, like federated kind of approaches. And you also, and you need those for two reasons. One is, like we saw with COVID, with the Florida and the California thing, where it's like, okay, which system is actually doing better here across the board? And it turned out that in terms of COVID, I think they were pretty much similar. I think actually Florida did slightly better. But then if you look at sort of multivariant analysis at all the other things, quality of life, etc., like Florida's like then up here because
I've never thought of that.
And then, but what you get to do is vote with your feet as well in a way, right? If you're in a federated system, and you're like, well, for me personally, I don't like these, so I'm going to go there, or like this thing is operating with governance rules which are clearly materially disadvantaging, me, my friends, my family, my networks, etc. Let's move in. So the system is more capable then of righting wrongs, whereas if you've just got
benefiting individuals, but that's
also,
probably why that's not what we've got.
But also, benefiting, but also experimenting with different ways of doing things.
And can evolve.
That in an evolutionary sense, you can say, okay, well let's trial the California approach, right? Because maybe this is going to lead. I mean, that's an extreme example, but in all sorts of different ways, in terms of how, all the different systems that we live under can be influenced locally, can be played with, and then in a way the conclusions can then actually be potentially moved up to another level and said, well, look, this really does work, and it's aligned with the fact that we don't know in advance sometimes how systems are going to interact and what will work best. So we have to, in an evolutionary sense, experiment.
And to experiment, you need the broadest range of variables to compute from. Not the problem with it, but that's obviously all totally right, and that's the common sense, and that's why you can't. I don't think you can look into anything long enough without coming to this as a sort of solution, that direction as the solution, right? The problem is, and it's sort of the interest. I'd never thought of it in this. You're using the Florida, California example, right? I've always said the reason my argument for decentralization is, disembodied, largely disparate. Not just to do the whole tribal group of 150 Dunbar's number thing, without even that, just the fact that divided in that way, you can't get hegemonic control, other actors will band together in order to suppress someone who's acting not in the interests of the collective or whatever. That's my sort of textbook, logical, sort of well-known reason for decentralization, right? But it's also in the myth-making like that, and it put me onto it when you talked about that California, Florida thing. You can't allow, if you were a centralized structure, if you centralized power that wants as much power as possible, you can't allow there to be an obvious distinction between these two states. You don't even need any sort of force. Just by that existing, it undermines your hegemonic will in overall, right? So just the fact that people are separated like that just creates an information sphere that's anathema to power. My point is this not why everything is a push for globalism? And it's why the argument against globalism and centralization, it's not just the disparate tribe thing. It's that there's no coming back from that. The more centralized it is, the more, regardless of what all of the variables are, the more a single narrative can be policed, and something else can't step up to sort of challenge it.
Yeah, and like you were, I think, implying 10 minutes ago or something, they potentially become security threats to the system. They become this could, you know, like you say, if it leads to an exodus or whatever,
an invading parasite into
But of course, you know, to the extent that the systems become completely corrupt, by which we could just define that as antithetical to the values and benefits of the population that it's purporting to serve. A positive parasite becomes, or a positive alternative becomes
recognized as parasitical.
Something that needs to be kind of attacked, you know. And so you end up, I mean, going back to the immune system, I guess maybe that it's a different kind of thing then, because in a way you're saying, well, actually the body itself has become terminally ill and is attacking the medicine.